Good evening and welcome. And tonight we have on the line Dan Conley, who's going to be telling us all about his time on submarines during the Cold War, which I'm sure is going to be absolutely fascinating. But before I hand over to Dan, I must, as always, give a shout out to our funders, the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. Who's going to be telling us about his time on submarines. Seems like we've got a bit of feedback there. Apologies for that. We do like a technical issue. Without further ado, I will hand over to Dan.
Good evening, Steve. Thank you for that introduction. First of all, why did I write the book, Down to the Sea and Submarines? Well, it was a follow-up of my first book, Cold War Command, but much more personal, hopefully vividly capturing the history of the submarine service post-World War II by someone who actually served in submarines in the specific era, 1967 to 1997. Unusually, I've actually been to sea in about 50 submarines, including those of the United States, Spain, and the Netherlands. These span boats in service from 1944, in the case of the World War II submarine I went to sea on called Totem, to the brand new Trident submarine Victorious, which commissioned in 1994. Next slide, please. Why did I join submarines? My younger life was spent in the Clyde fishing town of Campbelltown, where often there was based a trial submarine named Explorer. She was propelled by high test peroxide, HTP. This is the same stuff ladies used to make their hair blonde with, except it's a much concentrated form. Also, other submarines frequently visit the harbor. I was captured by all of these black, sinister craft coming into the lock with crews which always seemed cheerful and thoroughly professional. Unfortunately, HTP is extremely unstable and prone to small fires and explosions. Hence, Explorer got the nickname Exploder. Despite her achieving a record speed of 26 knots dive, this form of propulsion was eclipsed by the advent of nuclear power in submarines with the commissioning of USS Nautilus in 1955. Next slide, please. The submarine Kursk. Incidentally, it was an HTP torpedo which exploded in the Russian submarine Kursk in 2000, blowing up the front end of the submarine and killing the entire crew. Next slide, please. When I joined the Navy in 1963, we had just commissioned our first nuclear submarine called Dreadnought, and had set out an extremely ambitious Polaris nuclear missile submarine program, together with building up a force of nuclear attack submarines. Indeed, in 1969, our Polaris submarines commenced delivering continuous at-sea nuclear deterrents and have been doing so ever since without a break. Therefore, against the background of the rest of the Navy shrinking, it was most certainly the branch to be in. Plus, there was the attraction of the professionalism of the submarine service, where a serious mistake on the part of even a junior member of the crew could imperil the whole boat. I soon found myself having to get to grips with all the systems, dials and valves of my first boat, Odin, shown here. Rather, in that era, of too many of our surface warships spending vast amounts of time on spit and polish. Next slide, please. Was service in submarines considered dangerous when I joined? Yes, certainly the submarine service had a history of far too many peacetime accidents from its beginnings in 1903. Indeed, in the interwar years, we lost 9 boats in accidents and over 440 submariners perished. An absolutely dreadful peacetime record. Undoubtedly, the worst boats were the notorious steam-propelled K-class, shown here, in service between 1917 and 1931. which had too many hull openings, including funnels, and their very long length made them unstable when dived. 8 of this class were lost in accidents. Post-World War II, we lost a further 3 boats in accidents, Truculent in 1950 and a Fray in 1951, with an entire officer training class on board. In 1955, Sidon sank alongside in Portland Harbor owing to an experimental HTP torpedo explosion, again HTP, which involved many fatalities. Next slide, please. In 1963, the year I joined the Navy, the US lost the nuclear attack submarine Thresher. She suffered a serious flood during sea trials, which caused her reactor to shut down and she lost propulsion. With the ingress of water, she slowly sank into the depths and imploded at a depth of over 2,000 feet. Yes, when I joined submarines, it was considered a somewhat hazardous occupation, but since then it's got a lot safer. And whilst regrettably there have been accidents in our Royal Navy boats involving fatalities, there has not been the loss of a boat. Did I ever suffer from claustrophobia? Next slide, please. Prior to going to sea in submarines, everyone had to undertake escape training in the escape tank. This involved in stages learning to do a free ascent to the surface from 100 feet. This required being in a small chamber which flooded up, and when the pressure equalized with that of the main tank, ducking out into the tank and breathing out all the way to the surface. I think if you suffered from claustrophobia, you could not undergo this experience. Next slide, please. Of course, if you did not breathe out all the way to the surface, you risked bursting your lungs or suffering an air embolism, which could be fatal. Therefore, there were instructor stations at points en route to the surface to check you were breathing out properly. If not, a punch in the stomach would do the trick. So what was life like in diesel submarines? Next slide, please. The first boat I served on was Odin, an Oberon-class diesel boat, and I soon learned that in wintertime in rough weather on the surface around the UK, which of course often occurred, being a bridge watchkeeper was a very wet and cold existence. With no drying facilities, we often slept in damp clothes, drying them off that way before the next bridge watch. Life was confined to highly cramped living conditions, with almost the permeating and pungent smell of diesel oil. Not very good if you suffered from seasickness. At night when dived, the control room was completely darkened and the wardroom was illuminated only by red lighting to ensure a rapid adjustment to looking through the periscope. Fresh water was always at a premium, and at best in terms of personal hygiene, every couple of days you had a sluice done of the top half of yourself from a wash-hand basin. In my time in diesel boats, at sea, uniform was not worn, and as long as it was decent, anything was acceptable. Next slide, please. In a tiny galley, about 9 foot square, 2 chefs strive to produce more than 200 cooked meals a day for a crew of about 65 in number. Food was very important to the crew, and in general it was to high quality. However, there were challenges. Pudding mix tended to be hygroscopic and could attract diesel vapor, giving your delightful looking chocolate pud and other dishes a distinctly bitter, acrid flavor of diesel. Also, when snorting around the diesels when dived, the boat normally had a down angle, inducing the contents of pies or pastries to under the crust migrate to one end of the bake tray. Furthermore, variations in atmospheric pressure, which occurred a lot of the time, would cause havoc when baking bread. Next one, please. Now, in my era, before fuel cells and air-independent propulsion systems were in service, when dived, conventional diesel submarines had frequently to run their engines, drawing air down a snort induction mast. This was both to charge the batteries and bring fresh air into the boat. A separate mast exudes the exhaust gases. This system has several potential hazards. First, the induction mast, when in operation, involves a large hull opening with the risk of substantial sea ingress. Secondly, if the mast dips under the surface, a valve actuates to shut out the sea, but the engines, if left running, will suck air out of the boat to a dangerously low level. Also, if a drill error occurs, the boat can fill with lethal carbon monoxide from the exhaust. Finally, the batteries, when charging, emit hydrogen, which must be got rid of through a separate ventilation system, or else there's a risk of a serious explosion. Accordingly, in training, a lot of effort was put into safe snorkeling drills. It all sounds very fraught, but the crews enjoyed tremendous camaraderie and trust between each other and exuded a great deal of professionalism. Now, some people ask, was I ever frightened? Slide, please. Yes, my second submarine was Sea Lion, where indeed I experienced a very frightening and alarming situation because we lost control of the submarine. The scenario was off the coast of North of Ireland at periscope depth with a maximum snorting speed of 10 knots, acting as a sonar target for the brand new ballistic missile submarine Resolution. She was in a deeper depth zone below us. At 01:25 in the morning, the control room is in pitch blackness apart from a few illuminated dials in red, and I was about to take over the watch. Sea Lion had an old-fashioned setup, 2 planesmen instead of 1-man control, one control of the forward planes, the other the after planes. You can see here on the right were the forward planes, and to the left the after planes, and there are 2 depth gauges went down to a maximum depth of 140 feet. Suddenly, the after planesman yells that the after planes are jammed to rise. In accordance with the drill, he puts his planes into full dive using a separate emergency plane control system. The boat goes deep, a steep down angle, and the engines are shut down in emergency. Going deep, 2 small external ballast tanks were blown with an error, the outlet valve shut. The release operate with the crack of a loud explosion into the bilges right below the control room. A high-pressure air-driven jet of water from the bilges gusses into the control room and hits an electrical pump starter box, which explodes with a flash. With the planesman struggling to maintain depth, the 2 shallow water depth gauges, as shown there, shatter, spraying more water into the control room. Going past our safe depth, the captain quickly arrives in the control room on orders full astern. We eventually level out, then blow main ballast and emergency to surface. Because there was no operational accurate depth gauges now in the control room, the surfacing of the watch is ordered to open up when the upper hatch is still below the surface. This resulted in a deluge of more seawater in the control room, and the officer watch then nearly been seriously injured by being ejected into the conning tower by the high pressure of air leaving the submarine to the external. The cause of this dangerous event, a faulty after hydroplane angle indicator showing full rise, which caused the planesman to appear to have lost control of his planes and apply full dive. Next slide, please. Now, on a much more cheerful note, I devote a whole chapter in the book to stories about animals and submarines. And perhaps one of the most famous stories is about the reindeer. In early 1941, one of our boats, Trident, was alongside in Murmansk, Russia. The captain had complained to a Russian admiral that his wife was having difficulty in pushing her pram in the winter snow. The Russian response was that he needed a reindeer to pull the pram, and he insisted gifting a young reindeer. So, to avoid causing offense, the reindeer, which was named Pollyanna, was embarked through the torpedo loading hatch and Trident off the sea on a war patrol with the reindeer. The Russians had provided 2 barrels of lichen to feed the reindeer, but these soon ran out, and instead she was fed by galley straps, and she also loved the wartime favorite of condensed milk and cigarettes. She also ate a navigational chart. When the submarine surfaced at night and engines were run, Pollyanna made her way to under the conning tower hatch to breathe in fresh air, nudging crew members out of the way in the process. After 4 weeks at sea, Trident berthed in Harwich, and with the difficulty, Pollyanna was got out of the boat because she'd put some weight on. She was then given to a local zoo where she happily lived for many years. But poor old Trident never lost the smell of reindeer poo. Next slide, please. And with the American team, there was a case of Mobile, the Jack Russell, which did a deterrent patrol on the American SSBN Ethan Allen. However, his submarine career was terminated when he bit the relieving captain on the ankle. The dog was called Mobile. The name is the US equivalent of Swarfega, as he frequently needed cleaning off of oil and grease. He was portrayed in the film Crimson Tide, starring Gene Hackney. Next slide, please. So what was the change like when I went into a nuclear submarine, or served in a nuclear submarine? My first nuclear submarine was HMS Swiftsure, joining it in 1973, a nuclear attack submarine. It was like going from a Morris Minor to a Ferrari. Highly maneuverable, these boats can adopt very steep angles and roll, just like an aircraft, except they are 5,000 tons or more in weight, and there is not much of a margin between being at a safe depth and plunging below crush depth where the hull will implode. There can be less than 30 seconds to take action if there's a drastic controlled surface failure. Next slide, please. Nuclear submarines spend much more time diving, and of course there's no requirement to snort except in an emergency when the reactor is shut down, and then there's a need to run the diesels to provide power. The atmosphere is highly controlled, and life on board is much more comfortable and much less rough and ready than diesel boats. However, they are complex machines to operate and require the highest degree of professional standards. The demands of operating a machine with a nuclear reactor, and in the case of SSBNs, ballistic missile submarines, having intercontinental ballistic missiles with many nuclear warheads only a bulkhead away, should never be underestimated. Next slide, please. This slide shows a very simplistic diagram of a nuclear reactor in a submarine. To the left there, you've got the reactor, and there's high pressure water pumped through, which takes the heat away from the reactor. And this is in a steam generator turned into steam, which in turn, the steam is used to drive electrical turbogenerators and to drive the main engines of the boat. Our submarine nuclear reactors are built by Rolls-Royce, an association, and have not changed much in principle from that of the S2W pressurized reactor fitted in the world's first nuclear submarine Nautilus, completed in 1955. This has been an extremely safe design with tens of millions of hours of accident-free operation. Commercial small modularized reactors intended to be in service in the UK during the next decade will be based on this type of design as shown in the diagram here, but of course no main propulsion, just turbo generators to make electricity. Next slide, please. So how did I qualify to command a submarine? Well, after my time in Swiftsure, I was recommended to undertake the Submarine Commanding Officer's qualifying course, known as the parachute, because if it failed, you were out of submarines. At the time, no second chance. The sea phase of the course concentrated on several weeks of learning to attack high-speed escorts, working up to penetrating a screen of frigates to fire torpedoes at a fleet tanker. This slide shows the scenario in the control room with the student on the forward periscope and the instructor, known as the teacher, supervising through the more powerful rear periscope. Next slide, please. This was a highly stressful and indeed expensive form of training, with on occasion the frigates being instructed to try and overrun a periscope if it was sighted. As you can imagine, the sight through the periscope of frigate, like shown here, heading straight towards a maximum speed, certainly got the adrenaline up. And the teacher might increase the complexity of the situation by staging a distraction in the control room, such as a ranting chef wielding a carving knife, chasing a terrified sailor through the compartment. Next slide, please. So what sort of challenges did I have in my first command? Well, the first submarine I commanded was a 2,000-ton diesel submarine Otto. This was in 1975. She was not in good shape. She had lots of obsolescent equipment. She was the one submarine modified in the Royal Navy to be a target for practice torpedoes, and during my time in command was actually hit by a few of these, causing some damage. And there was the operational challenges, such as doing an underwater look upon a suspicious Soviet vessel stationed off the Shetland Islands. This required precise stationing and depth keeping under the vessel, with about 10 feet of separation between the top of my periscope and the bottom of the vessel. Once in station, a series of photographs or videos that then would be taken through the periscope. Next slide, please. On the other hand, there was the Mary Millington incident, where a pornographic actress was invited on board by some of the crew when the boat was in Nassau in the Bahamas. Once on board in the interim, she obligingly took off her clothes to be photographed by a host. A few months later, the story and the photographs hit the press. There was questions asked in the House of Commons. But perhaps the biggest casualty of the whole situation was my mother-in-law, who was shunned in her local conservative club and having such a dubious son-in-law. Next slide, please. Between 1981 and 1983, I did exchange service in the United States Navy. There were, of course, differences. The major difference I found was the scale of the US submarine force in my time in the submarine base in London, Connecticut. The United States Navy then had about 90 nuclear attack submarines in commission, with another dozen under construction and 30 SSBNs in commission, and half a dozen being built. It was a huge engineering and logistics challenge. I went to sea on 5 US nuclear attack submarines, and although the American equipment and weapon systems were more up to date than ours, there were not too many differences in the procedures and routines. However, a couple of the older boats I embarked on carried the Subrock anti-submarine nuclear missile with its 60-kiloton warhead. The weapons compartment in most nuclear submarines doubles up as a bunk space for additional personnel. For those sailors sleeping beside a nuclear warhead, they were provided with sections of borated polythene to protect their private parts from stray neutron radiation coming from the warheads. For myself, I did not have to undergo this experience and normally slept in the cabin shared with the executive officer under counterpane and sheets, instead of being provided with a smelly nylon sleeping bag, the norm in the Royal Navy. Next slide, please. I had 2 nuclear submarine commands, and I just will share a couple of experiences with you of these. First, at a short time in command of Courageous, the nuclear attack submarine Courageous, where the main task during my time aboard was a 3-month deployment of the Falkland Islands area in the spring of 1984, 2 years after the Falklands War had ended. During the deployment, we spent a couple of days at a buoy in San Carlos water. Very soon after we secured the buoy, 2 penguins came on board and stood sentry with our sailors for the next 2 days. One afternoon they were fed scones and jam, but that is not part of the South Atlantic penguins' diet, and they were a little bit sick afterwards. I went ashore one day calling on the governor, Sir Rex Hunt, and then I played golf at Port Stanley 18-hole golf course. It really was very rough and ready. There was 2 important local rules. You didn't get into the rough because of mines, and you were allowed to take a free drop out of shell holes on the fairways. Next slide, please. My second command was Valiant between 1984 and 1986. At almost 20 years old, she was Britain's oldest nuclear attack submarine at the time, and she had a fair share of mechanical problems and demanded a high level of maintenance. This picture shows a trim down to check her propeller. Despite that, she had unprecedented success in detecting and tracking a number of Soviet submarines to the west of UK. I had an excellent sonar team, and I describe in detail in my book my jousting with a lot of these Soviet boats. So what was the West confrontation with the Soviet submarine fleet all about? Next slide, please. Post-World War II, the Soviets built up a submarine force of 350 boats. Considering the Germans started World War II with only about 40 operational submarines, this large submarine force posed an enormous threat to the West's vital sea lines of communications. Consequently, the West devoted a lot of resources into anti-submarine effort, and indeed, the nuclear attack submarine became the most effective method of detecting and tracking Soviet submarines. Once detected, these could be covertly trailed for weeks and even months without the Soviet submarine knowing about the presence of a British or American submarine behind it. A high priority was to detect and follow Soviet SSBNs like the Delta class shown here, to be ready to promptly destroy them on the outbreak of hostilities. In all this effort, submarines were supported by arrays of listening devices planted in the deep ocean and which could detect submarines at very long range. This system was called SOSAs. Next slide, please. Post-war, the Soviet submarine force suffered numerous serious accidents and sinkings. Their boats were, on the whole, noisy, badly designed, and poorly maintained. Manned mainly by conscripts of very different ethnic backgrounds, they were always an accident waiting to happen. One of the most dramatic sinkings was that of the K-219, shown here, a Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine. She was patrolling about 700 miles north of Bermuda in October 1986. Owing to a defect on one of her nuclear-tipped liquid fuel missiles and crew error, the missile exploded in its tube. It blew its watertight hatch open and spilled 3 warheads into the ocean. Although the boat managed to surface, the explosion damage was such the boat sank a few days later, taking its remaining missiles and warheads to the seabed. Rumor has it that the Americans got there before the Soviets and removed the missiles as, on the wreck on the seabed, the missile tubes are now empty. Next slide, please. Now, one of the highlights of my career was running a series of test torpedo firings under the ice in the Beaufort Sea to the north of Alaska. The first under ice transit to the North Pole was undertaken by US Nautilus in 1958 And the first Royal Navy extensive under ice passage was undertaken by Dreadnought, the UK's first nuclear submarine, in 1969. For a nuclear submarine, operating under the ice poses the continuous challenge of, in the event of an emergency such as a fire, thin ice or open water needs to be found to enable surfacing, found quickly. In the case of a serious flood where corrective action needs to be taken immediately to empty the main ballast tanks, this poses a real hazard. Also, in shallow water such as the Bering Straits, the ice can reach down to the seabed, and in some areas such as the Canadian Northwest Passage, icebergs are likely to be encountered and obviously need to be detected promptly and avoided. The Arctic is now of great strategic importance, as among other issues, that is where Soviet ballistic missile submarines might hide in times of rising tension. Next slide, please. In the spring of 1988, the Royal Navy sent 2 submarines right over the top of the world, more than 1,500 miles under the ice to the Beaufort Sea north of Alaska. These were turbulent and superb. Their task was to conduct a series of under-ice torpedo firings on a tracking range the Americans set up on the ice. I was in overall charge of this operation. The firing of a total of 16 torpedoes was a great success, and all the torpedoes worked well and were recovered successfully. This series of tests demonstrated at the time the Royal Navy was very much on a par with the United States Navy in terms of under-ice capability. Next slide, please. Another career highlight was the acceptance of HMS Vanguard, the UK's first Trident submarine into service, for which I was responsible for. In the later part of my career, in the early 1990s, I worked at Foxhill in Bath and was in charge of a team of people responsible for accepting new submarines into service. This included Vanguard from the shipbuilder Vickers Engineering. Also, we had the acceptance of the last 3 diesel boats of the Upwater class from Camelaids at Buccaneering, the final diesel boats to serve in the Royal Navy. These procedures involved a series of inspections, final sea trials to confirm the boat had been built to contract specification and that all defects had been identified and the cause of remedy resolved. Next slide, please. A memorable day. I and a host of the great and the good were invited by Vickers to the christening of Vanguard in March 1992. Not to a launch, as she had already been lowered into the water in a shiplet. Just a breaking of a bottle of champagne against her fin. Princess Diana was sponsor, and sadly the occasion did not go well. Anti-nuclear protesters blockaded the shipyard, and a protester shown here tried to get into Princess Diana's car. Furthermore, the bus with all the VIPs got lost in the shipyard. The result was the whole proceedings got delayed, and the princess, very unhappily, having to endure standing on Vanguard's casing in the barrow cold for almost half an hour. You can tell she was not a happy princess. Next slide, please. In the latter part of my career, I was very much involved in submarine escape and rescue. As well as submarine acceptance, I had the role of chairman of the Royal Navy Submarine Escape and Rescue Organization, responsible for stewardship of the Royal Naval escape training and rescue systems. In recent trials, we had demonstrated escaping using free ascent to be feasible down to the depths of 600 feet, which is very deep. I had a ride in US Avalon, the deep submarine rescue vehicle, which is shown here on the slide on the back of the USS Batfish, an American SSM. This was an exercise which involved being rescued from a Spanish submarine, which was on the seabed of Malaga. Importantly, I headed up a major review of Royal Navy escape and rescue systems. This review affirmed the need in a distressed submarine situation for submariners to be able to escape and even better, be rescued by a rescue vehicle, keeping their feet dry. The sad losses in recent years of Argentinian and Indonesian submarines and the worldwide publicity those attracted reaffirmed our nation's responsibilities, despite all the costs involved in maintaining up to the mark submarine escape and rescue systems. And finally, what is today's situation regarding the Russian submarine threat and Britain's submarine force? Next slide, please. There are many less Soviet submarines in service, but they are quieter and much better quality. And unlike many other parts of the Russian defense infrastructure, they are well maintained and operated. On the other hand, the West has many fewer submarines or anti-submarine assets. The Royal Navy in particular has gone from, in 1989, 16 SSNs, nuclear attack submarines, and 14 diesel boats, to only 6 SSNs and no diesel boats. We also have problems with docks, maintenance, infrastructure, and key skills ashore. There are also shortcomings in recruitment and retention of submariners. Worryingly, continuous at-sea deterrence with our aging trident submarines hangs by a thread because of low SSBN availability, and some patrols involve over 200 days under the sea. One boat, Vengeance, is shown here returning from one such patrol covered in weed. I cannot conceive the challenges and demands upon the crew of such a long duration under the sea, out of communications with the outside world and their families. Next slide, please. So my last time at sea in a submarine was in 1995 to witness successful firing of a Trident D5 missile from HMS Victorious. Next slide, please. A very different experience of my first time to sea in a submarine in the World War II boat totem, shown here. What a contrast. That now completes my talk, and I'm very willing to take questions.
Dan, thank you so much for that. We've got a few questions coming in already, but as always, I will kick off. Before we started this, we were talking a little bit about, rather jokingly said, there's quite a lot of work for submarines given the sort of emphasis on undersea cables, and there seems to be I don't know if it's fair to say a change of tactics, although there no hard evidence is in the public realm about who is responsible for it. Is this an aspect of the submarine service's responsibility, area of responsibility or operations?
No, not really, because the guarding of cables is now undertaken by specialist surface ships. What submarines would do if Russian submarines were in the vicinity of the UK and they were up to some mischief is to track them and try to identify what they're up to, but not specifically, or so cable interruption. That tends to be the task of, as I mentioned, specialist vessels on the surface.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the future of the submarine service in terms of unmanned underwater submersibles? Do you think that's an important area of?
Yes, and indeed, you're absolutely right. And the Americans are putting a lot of effort into it. I don't think the Royal Navy is because of lack of resources. The Americans are developing systems where you fire launch an unmanned vehicle from the torpedo tube as it goes out, maybe does surveillance over days or maybe even weeks, then recover it back into the torpedo tube. It might be doing hydrographic work, or it might be trying to detect other submarines or other assets. So certainly, I think, excuse me, the Ukraine war has shown that drones and drone technology, it does have applications under the sea just as well. But I don't think the Royal Navy is it's a matter of affordability. Is taking that forward in the same way the Americans are.
Mm-hmm. So we've got some questions from the audience. First question, where's that gone? Was in the chat. Yes, a question from Joachim, if I've pronounced that correctly. Apologies
Yes.
if I haven't. Could Dan please share his views on the future of AUKUS? You might want to explain for our audience what AUKUS is as well, please.
Right. AUKUS is, I think it was set up in 2019, is a joint project between the Americans, ourselves, and the Australians. And basically, the long-term intention is the Australians should operate 8 nuclear attack submarines. There are various stages. The first stage is to train up American submariners at sea, sorry, Australian submariners at sea and American submarines, and train them up Australian shore staff to be able to maintain submarines, dock them, and look after them. And then about 2031, the whole concept is that Australians at that stage will acquire 3 Virginia-class submarines. And then beyond that, we're now talking the late 2030s, they'll acquire ASUK SSNs designed by between Britain and Australia with American help. And that there'll be a balance of 5 of these SSNs. But we're now looking really into the 2040s. Big challenges ahead in terms of designing the submarines, the jointly designed submarines, and get them into service. When we in the UK are suffering a dearth of skills in our shipyards, we are really struggling to deliver the Dreadnought class because for a long time we've hemorrhaged people who made nuclear submarines, and we're now trying to catch up. So big challenges ahead. There's political ones as well, and of course, one other challenge is the Americans are concerned about their SSN numbers, and of course, the part company with 3 of them, or even more, to the Australians would reduce their number of submarines they've got available. So, but from what I gather, there's numerous Australians now at sea embedded in American nuclear submarines, and American submarines are now being maintained in Western Australia near Perth. And from 2027, there'll be a rule of British or American submarines based in Western Australia.
And this is all really part of the, I guess, the US pivot towards China and the South China Sea?
Yes, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. And the prospect of China attacking Taiwan. And also, of course, Australia is concerned about their defense posture, not only with China, but with some potentially hostile countries to the north of them.
Mm. Okay, thank you. I think you know this chap who's going, because we've already spoken about him. This is Mike.
Oh my God.
And he says, always on for a joke. Hi, Dan. Excellent talk. Thank you. My question is, do former Valiant shipmates get a discount on your book? P.S. I was the NO, which I think is navigation officer, of Superb for the first double RN sub polar surfacing.
I think if he approaches me, I'll give him a very generous discount.
There you go, Mike.
I hope he has purchased the book already. I'm sure he has.
He should have done, really, shouldn't he? He really should have done.
Yeah.
Just being cheeky. You know what he's like. Mark asks a question: with the current acceptances of the Astute class submarines and the future acceptance of Dreadnought submarines, does a strong objective organization as CNSA still exist?
The answer is, I think, not.
Sorry, excuse me. What is CNSA?
That was Commodore Naval Ship Acceptance. I'm here. I'm on dodgy ground, but I get the impression there's not this the specialist core group of people we had in my time. The reason being my time, because we were kept busy all there was submarines rolling out the shipyards every 6 months or 8 months. Now with a gap of every 2 or 3 years, a new submarine coming along, You just can't keep a whole group of people dedicated to acceptance. So the answer is, I'm sure that on an ad hoc basis, teams will be formed to inspect the submarines and check out the systems and make sure they're safe before they go to sea. But there's not that. There's a group of people who were very experienced and well versed in that and dealing with shipbuilding.
Mm. So, do you think there's a case for diesel boats, given the high cost and the very slow production rate of nuclear boats?
Yes, I mean, I think one could make the case, and there's been recent articles in the press, but I think there's most recently one by a guy called Tom Sharp in the Telegraph. But we're struggling as it is to build nuclear submarines to then impose on top of that, so a new class of diesel submarines would really stretch our workforce, which is not elastic. And I might say BAE Systems and Barrow, they are trying to significantly expand their skills trade base, and they've established an apprentice training school up in Barrow, but it's going to take a long time. You can't make skilled engineers overnight. But I think they're going to go to expand their workforce by about 5,000 or 6,000 people in Barrow.
It's
They
difficult.
say it's going to take some time.
Yeah, it's difficult to get an appreciation of just how complicated a nuclear submarine is, isn't it? I mean, really are quite a remarkable piece of engineering. Mike has rather graciously decided to go to Amazon to purchase the book.
Right. Hoping, I would just say to Mike, please give it a good review.
Sure he will. I don't know who this question's from, but it's asking, can submarines use water with different properties such as temperature and salinity to make themselves less detectable with sonar, etc.?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the classic situation, let's take the Mediterranean in the summertime. You get warm water, which forms a layer down to about 100, 120 feet in the summertime, and surface ships with the active sonar find it very, very difficult to penetrate that layer because the sound waves they emit are bent upwards. So there are, and that's just one example, there's different propagation features in different oceans. So submarines can make good use of them. One of the things about under the ice in the Arctic is dead quiet, very quiet. There's no background noise, shipping noise. There's little animal noise. So you get phenomenal propagation. You can detect other submarines at very long range. And of course, with diesel submarines, always they have the option of sitting on the bottom and pretending they're just a wreck or something. So you can use the environment, very much so, yeah.
As a person who knows nothing about driving a submarine, which is probably for the best for the submarine service, you don't necessarily think of, shall we say, environmental conditions as being something that happens under the water. Layperson, you just think of it's all on the surface, don't you?
Yeah, well, I'm going to say another thing is that things like bioluminescence, that if a submarine is near the surface, is propelling itself along and hits a heavy layer of bioluminescence, you might be able to see it propelling from an aircraft or a helicopter. So you've got to be, I mean, you've got to be aware. You've got to be aware of these features when you're traveling in a submarine.
Yeah, and train for it. So, speaking of which, what is it like on Perisher? Can you give me a sense of what it's like from a sort of like an emotional or an intellectual perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty changed from my time because it's now just purely nuclear submarine focus or training because we don't have any diesel submarine. It certainly was a highly stressful form of training. And I think apart from being able to look through a periscope and have a good image of ships coming towards you or away from you, there was always a consideration in my mind, if I fail this, my career is over. Well, my submarine's career is over. You could go on perhaps be a successful surf ship man, but and some people just the periscope, they just couldn't handle say different ships through a very, very sort of narrow focus, which you've got in a periscope. It's only about 40 degrees of vision compared to the 180 degrees of vision you have normally, walking around the street or whatever. So, and some people, the course pushed them too far. And I wouldn't say they're in a mental breakdown, but they nearly came to breakdown stage. But it was all, trying to get some indication how you can take stress, how you can deal with stress. Some people deal with it a lot better than others. It was, I was in command of many stressful situations, but of course the parachute training helped me in that respect. Not the exact same scenarios, but I knew how to deal with stress.
Mm. Another question for you. What are Dan's thoughts on SSGNs? You've put, I think you mean BNs. Given the political issues surrounding nuclear weapons, are they a worthwhile alternative for nations such as SSGNs? Maybe it's right, my mistake. Are they worthwhile alternative for nations such as the UK?
Well, yes. I mean, a number of people saying that, we shouldn't, these new submarines we're building, rather than put ballistic missiles on them, turn them into SSGNs where they've got a whole bunch of conventional missiles like Tomahawks. And I think some American SSBNs have been converted in this way and can take about 160 missiles at one time. The only thing I would say is that with America, so more or less withdrawing from Europe and perhaps in many ways withdrawing its nuclear umbrella, how do we feel together with France having an aggressive nation not too far away in the form of Putin or his successors who have got thousands of nuclear warheads? And if we didn't have a nuclear deterrent, what would stop Putin saying, I'm going to invade Estonia or Poland? And if you stop me, I'm going to fire a nuclear missile at you or a nuclear bomb at you. That's where I think even the deterrents become very important now to the UK. Some people say, well, leave it to France, but do we want just to leave it to France? We've been in the nuclear game since 1948, and I think we must stay there, albeit it's very expensive. And dare I say, a lot of this extra expenses because of draconian nuclear safety regulations. And I think we've got to take a grip of that one. There's far too much regulations and bureaucracy surrounding building nuclear submarines and maintaining them. Far more than were in my day. And they really are excessive.
So as you've sort of said there, with kind of America retreating, I mean, who knows what the decision will be tomorrow, to be quite honest, coming out of Mr. Trump. What do you think the future of NATO is?
Well, I think it's got a strong future provided that the various nations really step up to the plate and start increasing their defense expenditure and coordinating, cooperating a lot more than they have in the past. There's been too much nationalism. And we look at the sum, even of the modest expenditure we all have. If you look at the sum of what's spent and what's delivered, it's not an efficient process at present, not in the least efficient. And we will have to, develop our own secure communication systems and satellites. It's just one example where we're rather naked without American support.
So it is that intelligence and overflight aspect that the Americans provide that we don't have any capacity, do I, ourselves?
Oh, we have some capacity, but not nearly as much as the Americans. Not nearly as much. And certainly, I mean, when I was even with the acceptance process, when you go into joint projects, which we did with the Italians and the French of a future frigate, it was named Project Horizon. Well named because you never get to the horizon. The project was never even started, but you did see this nationalism come out all the time. The French want to do this, and we want to do something different. The Italians want to do something different. There's got to be commonality. And go back to the AES UK SSM. One of the visions is that into the 2040s, all three nations have more or less a common design of submarine. so there can be common maintenance, common supply chain, and great efficiencies derived on that basis.
Do you think
that's the vision?
Do you think
That's the
it'll come to
vision.
fruition, or do you think?
Very challenging. Very challenging. There's no two ways about it. But there's a big, look, in 1962, we had no Polaris submarines. We had an agreement with the Americans, Kennedy and Macmillan, to acquire Polaris. And 5 years later, we had designed and built a Polaris submarine and had the missile tested at sea. It took 5 years because there was a national drive and vigor and impetus to get it done. We need that. And that seems a bit lacking at present.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Last couple of questions here. Do the UK, France, and the USA share the patrol areas for their ballistic submarines, and so wouldn't attack each other? And are there attack plans if we are responded to a threat wouldn't overlap on targets? So
no,
what I'm talking about is their coordination.
We very much guard our patrol areas as a national secret, and this has involved problems in the past, because you might recall, I think, 8 years ago, Vanguard collided with Triumphant in the same operating area. So we were obviously, it was a small collision, but obviously you don't want two submarines of different nations operating the same patch of sea. But no, but of course, in wartime, submarines would get their individual patrol areas, and they would not be allowed to attack other submarines when they're out of the patrol areas. So and that's the way it's worked from the Second World War, equally well. Strict delineation.
Very wise. How can family and friends at home best support serving submariners or sailors in general in their highly unique lifestyle? And this is talking about these. I think we've had a 9-month deployment, have we, on one of the SSBNs?
Well, 200 days, not quite 9 months, but no, I mean it's very, very challenging. I think very challenging indeed. I mean, we pay bonuses. I think £60 a day for every day the sailor or officer spends at sea in the submarine over 100 days. But money is not there. Is not going to solve it all. And that's a very good question. And there's no easy answers there, really. No, not at all. I mean, at the longer term, if we got more than 7 SSNs as the plan, say we're up to 12, and if we could man them, maintain them, I would certainly advocate that we set up a base again in Plymouth. So there's an opportunity for people to serve in the West Country, as opposed to be up north in Fars Lane all the time, which is not everyone's cup of tea. Apart from the midges in the summertime, there's 65 inches of rain a year, whether you deserve it or not. It's not the most delightful spot to live in. For a lot of people, it means being a long way away from their friends.
Yeah.
So, but we put all their eggs into Fars Lane at present. But if we did expand the future, I say that we ought to look at the option of being based elsewhere.
Okay. Finally, I have it's more of a message than a question, but I think you'll know this gentleman. It's from a chap called John Hook. And he says, "Sir, it is John Hook from Valiant and CSM."
Oh, I remember John Hook. Yes.
Good.
Hello, John.
He says, "It's good to see you again. Excellent talk. Thanks, John."
Oh, pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
That's a nice message. Thanks, John. Well, that just leaves me to say thank you ever so much for doing that talk. I do think the world of submarines is absolutely fascinating. And you have written another book, I realized today. So we might get you back. Talk a bit about that as well. Maybe.
No, the third book that I'm plowing my way through is going to be at least a year and a half before.
Okay, new book. If you're doing a new book, we will definitely get you back, Dan. So it's been an absolute pleasure. I just wanted to say thank you for agreeing to come on.